All right, I think we are live. I'm just getting confirmation that we are indeed live. And so happy to be here with my colleague and associate professor at George Mason University, Marieli Lopez-Santana. And we are checking for the live feeds. Oh my God, we are live. This is so magical. For somebody who was born in the 60s, and I just revealed my age, this is magic.
Thank you, Bassam, for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I'm going to do the formal introduction now so that we are on the same page with everybody who's tuning in. This is a second in the series of interviews that... what did I just do? Something odd just happened. Let me... one second. Huh. Something odd just happened. 1 second, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So here we go. Trying. I'm getting like 2 of me. But we can fix that. Okay. Well, here we are with Professor Marieli Lopez-Santana from George Mason University. Welcome, Marieli. I'm going to read your bio, but I just want to say hi. Welcome to the 2020 election and whatnot.
Thank you, Bassam, so much for the invitation. It's so great to be here.
So great to have you, Marieli. So I just want to say a couple words about you. Basically, Marieli, Professor Marieli Lopez-Santana is an associate professor and director of the political science graduate program at the Schar School at George Mason University. She works on federalism and state-local relations, on which she's writing an article, I understand, right now. Her book, entitled the new governance of welfare states in the United States and Europe, between decentralization and centralization in the activation era, explores contemporary changes in the organization of welfare states in Italy, Germany, Spain, the UK, and the United States. How did you do all that? Okay, she continues to explore issues related to welfare states and inequality, as well as multilateral governance, federalism, and decentralization. So, Marieli, as everyone knows, you can see in the background, everybody's watching to see what the elections are up to, or maybe just bored and not watching. But we are excited to have you here because you're going to be addressing something that has to do with Puerto Rico and elections, which is something that you will not hear about on American television or mainstream television. I am glued to various networks. I haven't heard anything. So can you describe, can you talk a little bit about this first, and then right after describe for us the nature of the party system in Puerto Rico?
Sure. So thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here about something that is not covered in the mainland, right? But indirectly, it has a big effect on the election, in my view, because if you look at, for example, all the Puerto Ricans who are living in Pennsylvania, they might affect the final outcome, right? So Puerto Ricans do play a special role in the case of the United States or the mainland because we are U.S. citizens, right? So to give you some context about the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico. And there were about 60 years in which Puerto Rico was somewhat in a political limbo. In 1917, Puerto Ricans actually became citizens of the United States. So they actually acquired their legal status. And it's not until the 1950s, in the process of, the broader concept of decolonization that is ongoing around the world, that Puerto Rico has creates its own government that pretty much follows the structure of federalism in the United States. So we are not a U.S. state, as you know, right? But all Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. There's not such thing as having Puerto Rican citizenship, right? And we have kind of a special status in the sense that we are an incorporated territory of the United States with different type of rights for Puerto Ricans who live in the mainland, but somewhat equal rights for the diaspora that lives in the United States. So to put it briefly, that's the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Marielle. I was on mute. I was trying
okay.
not to like bother everybody with my breathing, and I ended up like okay. Thank you for this. Let me ask you about the implications of the electoral success of newly created parties in Puerto Rico, and then of course I want to ask you a couple other questions, and maybe as I did with my previous interview with Professor Jennifer Victor, end up with talking a little bit about the stuff that people like to sometimes listen to and engage with, which is partly gossip, partly the lighter stuff around the elections in Puerto Rico, and some of the prejudices and some of the lighter stuff regarding the topic. But first, what are the implications of the electoral success of the newly created parties in Puerto Rico?
Right. To give you some context, in the 1950s, Puerto Rico actually created its own constitution. So as a consequence of that, then there's a process in which by itself there's a creation of new local parties. And there were three political parties mainly. There were the Commonwealth Party, which ruled for a very long time in the 50s and the 60s, who was a very important actor in terms of pushing the process of modernization. Puerto Rico is an example of modernization theory, those who are familiar with modernization theory. So there's a pro-status quo type of political party that wants to keep the relationship, the current relationship that Puerto Rico has with the mainland. There's another political party that's a pro-statehood political party, the PNP, who of course wants to become the 51st state of the United States. And then finally, you have the pro-independence party that supports the independence of Puerto Rico. But more recently, in the last electoral cycle, what we see is that new political parties have emerged, in part because people are fed up with the idea that politics in Puerto Rico mainly are organized around the issues of the status of Puerto Rico with the United States or with the mainland. So you have these new political parties who are dealing with alternative issues of policy, of inequality, of provision of public goods, for example, but they are not so centered on the conventional question of what is the relationship of Puerto Rico with the United States. So now, probably as many of you know, in the last 4 years, Puerto Rico experienced the big hurricane Maria. In addition to that, there were earthquakes, major earthquakes. Also, it's in the process of bankruptcy. And then, of course, you have COVID, right? So the last 4 years have not been good to Puerto Rico. And then on top of that, last summer, Puerto Rican ousted the elected governor. So did that after a scandal, right? So you have a huge process of social mobilization that resulted in the ousting of the governor. And then now you have a governor that wasn't elected. So now we have, 2 days ago, we had elections, but it turns out that the PNP, the pro-statehood party, the same one that was in party, was the one that was elected. But what we see is that newly created political parties and also the pro-independence party altogether got 35% of the votes, which is major because for the most part, the history of Puerto Rico has been about two political parties dominating the elections and also the position of the governorship. And in addition to that, you have that the major city of Puerto Rico, San Juan, the capital, it might be the case that a newly elected party might be, the mayor will be from a newly elected party.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks so much for this. And when we talked earlier, you mentioned something, and we chatted about the plebiscite. What are your thoughts on the outcome of the plebiscite, on the status of Puerto Rico, the nature of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, and should it become a state, and so on? This is something that, again, that's not something that we hear much about, even even on like places like NPR.
Right, exactly. So that's the quintessential question for Puerto Ricans and the United States. There has been a few plebiscites, and for the most part, it's almost 50-50. This time, I think it was 54%. So it wasn't that pro statehood. So the question is, you have many of my woke friends in the United States who say, well, Puerto Ricans do not have the same type of powers, and also if you think more broadly about citizenship, they're second-ranked citizens, right? Because they cannot vote for president in the mainland. However, my take is a little bit different from that, because it's not taking into account what Puerto Ricans want. And it's very clear that Puerto Ricans do not have a clear say about what they want. It's completely 50-50, right? 50% of the population wants to become a state, while the others do not, right?
No, this is thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about the atmosphere? I mean, you probably I know that you have contacts, networks, and so on. Mm-hmm. What is the mood like? I mean, what is being discussed, and what could be the aspirations of people in Puerto Rico? I mean, the marginalization of this population in mainstream circles is evident. I mean, and in light of that, how do the people of Puerto Rico take this and take the implications of the elections? Do they care? I mean,
right. I think there are two groups, right? Those who see the glass half full and those who see the glass half empty. On one hand, you have people who are very disappointed by the fact that the same people who were in power during the hurricane, the same ones who stole our money, the same people who didn't release all the different type of aid that came from the mainland and also from different NGOs, were the same ones that were elected. So of course, many people are disappointed for the lack of change. On the other hand, some other groups think, well, that is a major development, that you are not longer in an era of bipartisanship, right? Not longer two political parties are completely ruling. Now there are other political parties who are checking the power as mayors within the legislative. So I think this might be the beginning of a process of change. But it depends, right? What happens in the long run, and but also it was extremely close, the outcome. So it's a clear signal that people are not happy with the status quo and that they're not willing to support it.
And of course, this also harks back and to the response to various developments and of course the natural disaster that befell Puerto Rico, and how the administration dealt with it. Is there anything in particular about these elections that you want to address, either separately, because I would love to hear your perspective, either separately from the question of Puerto Rico and its statehood and the relationship of that population to what's happening in the United States, or in relation to Puerto Rico? Is there anything that we should take note? Is there anything that you'd like to share with us to sort of expand our base of knowledge or imagination as to this relationship?
Right. If Biden becomes a president, we might see an active discussion about the possibility of Puerto Rico becoming a state. Why? Because Puerto Rico is mainly a Democratic island, right? There are, of course, some Republicans, right? But that would mean two more seats on the Senate that are Democrats, right? And you know the implications of that. And on the other hand, of course, on the lower house. So that might be one of the discussions that will be put on the table if Biden becomes president, especially in the context of the bankruptcy of the island. So that's one important dimension that people do need to pay attention to, including in the case of DC, right? Which is the same type of discourse and also discussion that is ongoing, because for a very long time you have the issue of DC becoming a state, and now you see that there's a reemergence about the possibility of that happening again, right? So that's one dimension. And then the other dimension is how is it that political parties are talking about the importance of Latinos in terms of the vote, right? And you have seen, you know, the idea that Florida Latinos, it's not because Latinos that Biden lost Florida, but that's not completely accurate, right? Because that's only one section or one group within Latinos. We are not a monolithic group. We have different type of perspective, different type of preferences. For example, 75% of Puerto Ricans voted for Biden in Florida compared to 20-something% of Cubans. So Cubans are very different from Puerto Ricans, right? Just to put it in that way. So that importance of having a more nuanced way about the political power of Latinos in the United States, we need to kind of open the black box of Latinos. For us, it's obvious, right? But for the mainstream, that's not the case, right?
Yeah, and what about the the non-Puerto Rican, non-Cuban Latino population? There was a poll, and of course, after this elections, I'm not sure how much credibility polls will have, because they predicted so much before the elections, and now here we are, neck to neck. They predicted so much as to Biden being well ahead in a clear way. What about the basically Puerto Rican, non-Cuban Latino populations? Is there something you would like to share with us about this? There was a poll that basically said that there is support for Trump among male Latinos besides the Cuban population. Is there any truth to that? Does that ring true, or is there a reason for this?
That you can always think about gender dimensions. Of course, it is important to recognize that there's a patriarchal type of discourse within the Latino communities. It is true that might have younger populations who don't believe that anymore, right? And trying to break the structures of patriarchy and machismo, right? Mm-hmm. So that might be one element. This is just speculations from general knowledge. Maybe it's not completely true, but this is just a hunch. And then another thing that we have to take account into when it comes to the case of Miami more specifically is that there's a relatively new group, which are the Venezuelan-Americans, who mainly had a lot of money in Venezuela. Venezuela has oil, right? And with Maduro and Chavez, they migrated to mainland, or they were coming back and forth, but then they decided to stay in the United States. And of course, you know, it's the same type of situation with Cubans. This idea of the Democrats that are more leftist resonates with the discourse of socialism, right? So that is another group that many have said that voted also for Trump with the Cuban Americans.
Thank you so much, Marieli. I mean, just the focus on Puerto Rico alone is so important, given that we hardly hear about it, and you know, it just seems that with the progress of time and the expansion of the proportion of the Latino population in the United States, you know, and I've been following elections since the mid 1980s. Again, I'm really feeling how old I am. But do you see a projection going forward in terms of the impact of this sort of this vote, of this population's vote? Do you see any kind of changes, say, with the Cuban vote? I mean, it's been you know, consistent with Bush and then McCain even, and then of course now Trump. Would that are there reasons, generational reasons, that this might change? And in general, regarding the broader Latino vote, is it it's likely to become more and more, to have more and more of an impact? But are we at a point where we have reached the potential? I mean, is the mobilization of those communities at such a high level that we are seeing basically the potential now, or is there a lot of work that needs to be done before these populations, like other populations in the United States, go to the polls in larger numbers and proportions?
You know, I think it's just a simple question, demographics, right? The Latino population is the first in terms of growing population in the United States. So in that way, if you just only look at demographic changes, we do have to take into account that this is a population that increasingly will have more political power, and we shouldn't assume that they're less likely to vote, right? Because that's not true. So that's one assumption that people need to kind of discard, right? And also the fact that the same, right? Latinos are not automatically democratic, right? As you mentioned, there are some issues with the patriarchal type of culture and institutions that maybe many Latinos support. So if you have a person like Trump, some population, especially males, as you noted, right, might gravitate towards that. So it is not that Democrats should take for granted Latinos. However, I have to say that I don't study political behavior. That's not my area of expertise. So I have to be careful about how I speak about this.
No, I mean, these things are conversational, and I'm always happy to sort of explore other dimensions than the ones that we addressed. But the interesting thing about what you had shared about Puerto Rico, the interesting things are basically the fact that, like, let's say, I mean, I connected with you in order to hear this dimension, is that it's all new. Like, unless you are seeking this information about Puerto Rico, you won't get it, and you won't actually learn very much about it. So I really would like to thank you for giving us these nuggets, these insights, this information, not just about the elections, but also about the plebiscite and about prospects for statehood. And I bet this is something that we will hear more about, maybe under a Biden administration. I mean, perhaps. I mean, that's the hope. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we let you go? I promised you about 30 minutes, and we're approaching that limit.
Yeah, sure. So maybe 2 points. I think people should really pay attention to the Latino vote in the case of Pennsylvania. as I said, people have estimated that about 500,000 Puerto Ricans and also Dominicans who are in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and this might be the determinant population if Biden wins, right? So people typically talk about New York or Florida or the New Mexico and Arizona, but some people tend to forget that Latinos do have political power all over the map, right? Michigan, for example, right? The Mexican-Americans in Detroit. So that's an important consideration. And another issue if Biden becomes president is also, we have to remember that Puerto Rico has been bankrupt for a few years now. It's a pseudo bankruptcy, but it's the largest bankruptcy in the United States. So this is an issue that needs to be solved, right? Especially Wall Street is putting a lot of pressure on this. And Biden should do something about the governance of the bankruptcy procedure, because it's not helping Puerto Rico to move forward, and also is creating different type of issues from the financial perspective on the mainland. So this is something that the press doesn't cover, but is very significant for financial markets and, more importantly, for Puerto Ricans in the island.
Thank you so much, Marieli. This has been wonderful, and I'd love to, talk more with you about this in the future. And maybe I'll see you sometimes, because we're colleagues and we have offices almost right next door to each other, but we're not seeing each other at George Mason. So I hope that we get to see each other soon. And I'll let you go back to your life. And thank you for the time that you've given us and the insights you shared with us. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.